Joining us now are Eddie Glaude, chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, and Jamelle Bouie, New York Times opinion columnist and co-host of the Unclear and Present Danger podcast. Thank you both for joining me tonight. Professor, how do you square what Carlson and Fox News have done to America with his very clear acknowledgement that hate is cancerous when it comes to himself and his own body?
It's almost a kind of distillation of the work that mobs do in attacking scapegoats. So imagine the people who participate in a lynching. Imagine them individually as persons who think of themselves as decent, but getting caught up in the frenzy of the mob and suddenly find themselves bloodthirsty. And the scapegoat, remember, works as a way to consolidate a sense of fragmented identity. That's too academic. What do I mean? When there's a sense in which people feel a sense of terror and panic about who they are, when the incoherence of America makes itself known, there's a need for the scapegoat, the violence directed towards the other, whether it's black people, whether it's immigrants, whether it's gay people, whether it's women, right? So that scapegoat then becomes the basis for a sense of coherence, a sense of identity, a sense of community. And in the midst of the violence, there could be a tinge of guilt. But this is the workings of the mob, and the mob does what it does.
And Tucker Carlson does what he does, and Fox lives another day. Jamelle, I don't want to call it it's not self-reflective, but there's something happening in both these uncensored moments off camera that Media Matters has gotten a hold of, and the texts themselves. It's not self-hatred. It's an acknowledgement that what is happening to him and the way that he's thinking about things is poisonous, and yet he still needs to double down on his superiority. When he talks about that, when in the text, he's adamant that white men don't fight like this, that if he enjoys the blood sport of it all, then he's no better than the Antifa kid who's getting the living crap beaten out of him. How do you understand this correspondence?
I think I see it in similar terms to Professor Glaude, and for me, the key thing is his statement that this is not how white men fight, which, as a parenthetical, thinking about mob violence in American history, thinking about the history of lynching, it just may well be. But that fact check aside, it's clear that Carlson imagines his whiteness to be something of an ennobling characteristic, and so it causes him deep psychological distress when he is confronted with the reality that it is not, that he is not actually some better kind of person whatsoever, and he has to sort of quickly rationalize that. Having said that, I also want to say that part of me wants to go down this road of psychoanalyst of Tucker Carlson, but part of me also recognizes that he is very much a cynical operator. We know that he was not actually a fan of Donald Trump, for example, said derogatory things about Donald Trump, very clearly sees his audience as, for lack of a better term, a bunch of rubes. And looking at his transformations over the course of his career, you can make a very good case that he just says what he needs to say, depending on the audience he happens to have. And that, to me, is also part of this story, that this is a profoundly cynical person weaponizing really the worst impulses that we have for his own self-aggrandizement as a television personality and for the agenda of his employers, which is upper income tax cuts, strengthening the power of large corporations and the very wealthy in our society.
I do want to place him as a figure in history, though, Professor, because he represents so much of the inheritance of of America on the topic of race, right? This idea of white nobility and white gentility has been used since slavery times to justify violence against people of color. And Tucker Carlson is no different in that attitude than white people were in the 1700s. And I think it shouldn't be shocking, but it remains shocking to me. And I think it's worthy of calling it out when we see it. The idea that the day after January 6th, when a largely white mob attacks the Capitol, and this man is drawing a line saying, this isn't how white people fight. Well, yesterday, the day before he wrote that text, we saw how white people fought.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, the past is never past. That's Faulkner. Was never was. And so what do we see? We see this kind of through line. We can trace the Great Replacement theory back to 1790, the first Immigration Act, which establishes access to U.S. citizenship for white people only, when whiteness hasn't even been consolidated as a category. Immigration law shows us this. Take us back to 1919 with Madison Grant's book, The Passing of the White Race. 1920, Lothrop Stotter's book, you know, The Rising Tide of Color Against the World White Supremacy, right? And then how that's connected to the French writers of Renaud Camus, who writes The Great Replacement. And before him, that's 2012, before him, Jean Raspail, you know, The Camp of Saints, that's 1973. All of this stuff around whiteness has everything to do with the tricky magic necessary, right, to maintain this illusion that somehow white people carry with them a sense of superiority, which means that they should be valued more than others.
Yes.
And Tucker Carlson sits in that sweet spot, and Fox exploits it.
You know, Jamelle, as the professor so brilliantly says, the exploitation on behalf of Fox of all of this cannot be ignored, right? And we started this segment talking about what's happening in Florida with Ron DeSantis, the mainstreaming of anti-CRT, anti-DEI, the Republican Party basically taking its orders in some ways from Fox News is a phenomenon that's shaping American life today. And I wonder if you think, well, what you think of that, and also the degree to which the ouster of Tucker Carlson is a cause for any sort of introspection on the part of Republicans who parrot this garbage and make it law.
You know, I doubt there will be any cause for introspection among Republicans because of Tucker Carlson's ouster. I think there may be because of the fact that this crusade against DEI and CRT or what have you, which always just seems to be some sort of term of abuse for sort of immigration, this crusade against that doesn't actually seem to be resonating with American voters very much. That again and again, when you ask voters, like, do you think your kids should learn about slavery in school? Do you value diversity in schools and the workplace? Americans say yes. How maybe this doesn't necessarily filter down entirely to their political commitments, but it does suggest that like the Republican obsession with this may not be paying the kind of political dividends that they hope. And Ron DeSantis's recent decline as a presidential candidate might be evidence of that. So if there's any cause for introspection, and again, I highly doubt we'll see much, it's going to be because this stuff isn't really working the way they may have hoped it would work to win elections. And just to not to repeat myself too much, but I also think it's worth saying that part of the goal of this, talking about what Fox's interest, talking about the Republican Party's interest, part of the explicit goal of this is to take people's salience and remove it from the real questions of education, adequate funding for schools, making sure teachers are well qualified, making sure that there is educational infrastructure that can treat all students equally, redirecting people's anxieties and worries away from that and towards a kind of imaginary enemy, kind of imaginary group of enemies that are trying to put you down and denigrate you. And the people who benefit from this, as is always the case, are, for example, the people who seek to make money on privatized schools, the very wealthy and the corporations and the owners of capital who have a vested interest in siphoning wealth from public coffers. And so I also think it's again important to maintain that perspective as well, that this isn't just sort of an expression of prejudice, it's also like a deliberate political strategy to divide people for very cynical reasons.